Hello, and welcome to the latest installment in our series on law in time of crisis. I am Michael Cahill, the Dean at Brooklyn Law School. I am delighted to be joined today by Associate Professor Sabeel Rahman, who is on the Brooklyn Law School faculty, and we will be talking today about the possibility of democratic and economic reform in the current moment of crisis. Sabeel, maybe before talking about the present moment, we can discuss the past a little bit. Your first book, Democracy Against Domination, from 2017, which I take it is available on Amazon for our interested viewers, Oxford University Press, look for it by name, was about democratic reform in the progressive era, another time of turbulence and change. How has that moment or other moments in our constitutional history offered lessons for the current political and social moment?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dean Cahill, for having me, and of course, the whole Brooklyn Law School community. There's so much going on right now in this moment that can be really hard to make sense of. But one of the things that I think is really striking about this current moment that we're experiencing in the country is that it's not totally new. It is actually sort of another iteration of some long-standing tensions and struggles in our American democracy that go back really to the founding and beyond. So there are two parallels in particular that I think about a lot in this moment. One is Reconstruction right after the Civil War, and the other is the Progressive Era and the New Deal that you mentioned. But I think what we're experiencing now is sort of the combination of those two crises, right? It's a battle about racial equity and democracy, and it's also a battle about economic inequality and how do we have an inclusive economy after the COVID crisis.
Having discussed our national history, I'd like to bring in a little bit of your own personal history. You're now a scholar of administrative law and economic reforms, and that's part of your own past, having served as an advisor to the city on economic policy, as well as having served as a public member of the Rent Guidelines Board. So you mentioned various large-scale New Deal reforms of the past. How is your familiarity with that or your own personal experience something that informs your sense of what reforms are possible now? What do we think is on the table that might address some of the current economic issues that we're facing in our society?
This is a moment of challenge, but there's also a lot that is possible coming out of this moment. If you think about the protests in the streets around racial justice, big new ideas about what a new economy might look like around potential recovery and reconstruction. There's a lot still to be done. So, I came into this work really through a couple of routes. You mentioned, Dean, my work with the city in the early days of the de Blasio administration on economic inequality policy right before joining the faculty at Brooklyn. Also spent a lot of time thinking through the debates around the Dodd-Frank reforms post-financial crisis. So the 2008 financial crisis led to a bunch of macro reforms coming out of Congress in 2010. And a lot of my early research, writing, and thinking was about those debates and sort of what worked and what didn't. I'm currently, for the last 2 years, have been serving as president of Demos, which is a national think tank working on issues of racial inequality and economic inclusion. And so from that vantage point, we're seeing just a ton of not just organizing on the ground, but really big new policy ideas around the economy, around things like debt cancellation, for example, around using a Green New Deal and climate reconstruction, as a source of jobs, but also as a source of investment in our infrastructure. There's just a lot that is on the table right now. And so part of the push-pull of this moment is that the crises are so severe, but at the same time, it's a pretty unique opportunity where big ideas, policy ideas, are moving into the mainstream very quickly. And so it's sort of a race of how much can we build out those ideas, figure out the legal vehicles, legislation, regulatory policies, and see what we can get done at the federal level or at the state level.
You talked about your current role moonlighting from our faculty as president of Demos, which of course not only deals with economic reform, but also issues of reforming democracy. What are the current ways that you've seen democracy under threat as you've been in that position, and what opportunities have you seen and are you pursuing to enable democratic reform?
Yeah, so this is we're in a pretty dire moment right now as we're speaking. In the summer of 2020, with the election looming ahead, there are really three big crises on the democracy front. One is a kind of rampant and accelerated press on voter suppression. So you're seeing both deliberate and as a result of the COVID pandemic, a real narrowing of the capacity for Black and Brown voters in particular to exercise their political rights. So the closing of polling places, for example, kicking people off the voting rolls, attempts to intimidate voters at polling places. You see counter protesters walking around with heavy armor and machinery in front of polling places. So there's just a lot of things happening that are aimed at suppressing the vote. That's the first problem. The second problem is you have attacks on the election administration machinery itself. So the president talking about defunding the Postal Service this week at a time where, because of the pandemic, a lot of Americans are going to have to rely on vote by mail in order to safely cast their ballot. And then the third thing is we actually are coming up on a pretty dangerous potential constitutional crisis of legitimacy. What happens on November 4th if we're still counting ballots, which assuredly we will be given the rise in vote by mail? We're still counting ballots, and we have one side, claims victory while we're still actually waiting for a certified result. There's just a lot of uncertainty right now, and so that's kind of the landscape. Through Demos and also with lots of other great civil rights and voting rights organizations and champions. I think you have different organizations focusing on these three different pieces. As lawyers, I think is a really important moment to be thinking about, how we combine litigation with policy design, right? There's actually a lot of regulations that have to be updated, statutes that have to be updated to deal with the vote by mail and pandemic problems. And then how all of that connects to the sort of broader public discourse, right? How do we educate more people about what might happen on November 4th to sort of inoculate against false claims about election fraud or voter fraud, right? So there's just a lot of different avenues of activity between now and November.
No shortage of immediate threats, as you've just identified, to which you are responding and reacting. What prospects do you think there are in this moment, not only to address the immediate threats, but to arrive at some meaningful, more fundamental reform that sort of transcends the immediate crisis moment that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I think it's easy, especially in a moment like this one, to be just in a reactive mode. But of course, we also have to be thinking about how do we make sure these problems never happen again, right? How do we actually solve some of the deeper systemic inequities in our democracy, right? Problems of voter suppression were here, a year ago and 10 years ago and 20 years ago as well. So part of what I think is exciting about this moment is there's also been a ton of work to flesh out big, massive legislative change on our democracy system. So a year or so ago, the House passed the For the People Act, shorthanded as HR1, which is the biggest omnibus democracy reform bill to go through probably ever, short of the Voting Rights Act from '65. It's everything from money and politics reforms to fair redistricting procedures to prevent gerrymandering, to a range of measures to prevent the kind of voter suppression and intimidation tactics that I mentioned earlier. So that's a really important piece of legislation. If Congress changes hands as an opportunity in the spring, that will be a really important fight to see what policies we're able to pass. There have also been other proposals that are also now being talked about, reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act after it had been undermined by the 2013 Shelby County case, which we can talk about. Also proposals about statehood. Should DC be a state? What about Puerto Rico and the territories? Should we reform or even abolish the Electoral College? These are pretty big structural questions that are now being talked about and debated seriously.
Well, you've certainly seen these issues from a number of different perspectives, from the academy, inside government, and non-governmental organizations and think tanks like Demos. For members of our audience who are thinking about what they can do to engage with these issues, other than writing a check to Demos or, for that matter, to Brooklyn Law School, particularly an audience of lawyers, are there particular things that lawyers should be thinking about in terms of ways they can engage or opportunities for reform?
Yeah, there's just so much that needs doing right now. We kind of need all hands on deck. For folks who are not directly already involved in, say, um, voter suppression litigation or some of these kind of immediate avenues, there's going to be a huge need for election security and election monitoring and election protection. So usually in an election, there are all sorts of volunteer systems set up for poll watchers, lawyers to be on call for if there's a problem in a polling place, especially if you think about it in a contested swing state or in an area where you have Black and brown communities who might face increased threats or intimidation to their access to the ballot. There's also going to be a really important, I think, after election day set of needs that we don't quite know what they'll be yet, but if we are in a contested election scenario, it's going to be really important for to have a defense of the rule of law in that moment, right? Because we have a system, we have procedures that need to be followed. There'll be, I'm sure, a temptation by folks seeking elected office to bypass those procedures, and there's going to need to be a strong voice across, not affiliated with any party, but across the political spectrum about what our democratic system is and what those rules need to be. And then I think there's also going to be a lot of need for getting involved in grassroots organizations, civil society organizations, depending on what state or kind of geography you're in. There are a lot of great organizations that are knocking on doors, making sure people are registered, helping people get re-registered, right? All kinds of stuff like that are going to be really critical to surviving the threats to this election ahead.
Throughout this series, we've had the opportunity to have members of our faculty shed light on current issues and crises. It's also been a good opportunity to have a sense of how those issues of the moment inform the work that those scholars are doing. We mentioned your first book earlier. You also came out with a second book recently on civic power that addresses some of these issues that we've been discussing. I wonder if you want to say a few words about that second book project and whether there's anything else going on in the world that is informing future ideas and scholarly projects of yours.
The second book with my co-author, Holly Russin-Gilman, is called Civic Power. And it really is about this idea that democracy requires not just an election every 2 or 4 years, but actually depends on a larger infrastructure. You need civil society groups, you need more participatory ways of engaging affected communities in day-to-day decision-making. And these are all products of law, right? We have laws that govern, can workers organize? We have laws that protect association, right? Obviously the First Amendment, though it's been applied in disparate ways when you actually look at how the laws played out. And then we have laws that structure government, administrative law, local government law, things that shape who the zoning board listens to, who sits on the Fed, how the EPA makes its environmental rules. And so these are all kind of issues that I think are really ripe for the kind of linking of legal scholarship and legal analysis to kind of flesh and blood live issues that you asked in your earlier question, what can lawyers do? One thing that I really love about this work is, you have issues that really matter to people on the ground in their day-to-day lives, and you need a legal expertise or a legal understanding about the engineering to think about, what should the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, look like in order to ensure that the most affected groups have a say in the regulatory process, or how might we rejigger local government law? And so these are the kinds of things that we talk about in the Civic Power book. There'll be so much that'll be written about, I think, when 2020 comes to a close eventually. But there are a couple of things that I'm paying attention to right now in particular. I think you mentioned, Dean, the analogy to the New Deal and the progressive era. If there is a new administration, or even if there isn't one, either way, there's going to need to be a recovery program in response to the economic collapse that we're in. And that's going to require all the best lessons learned from the past about administrative law, about economic policy, about sort of the poverty law, right? All sorts of areas, antitrust law, if you think about sort of the new forms of corporate power. So all of that is going to have to be brought to bear. There's going to be a lot that needs to be written about for scholarship purposes, but also for public policy purposes. So if folks are getting excited and motivated in this moment, there's no shortage of topics to be researched and written about and acted on.
Well, we're delighted to have you as a person to talk about these topics with. Happy for the time. I know you're being kept very busy given that you're continuing to serve as president of Demos at the moment, even as you're coming back to rejoin our teaching faculty in the upcoming year.
Very
With an
excited.
election of just a few months away, there's plenty of things on your plate. It's been a pleasure discussing these issues with Professor Sabeel Rahman. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for viewing, and be on the lookout for the next installment in our series on law in time of crisis.